This is the Erasing Shame podcast, Season 3. Honest talk for healthy living, growing, and thriving. Welcome to another episode of the Erasing Shame, and today I'm joined with Fred Mok, and he's up in San Francisco. I'm down here in Orange County, and we got connected as internet friends a couple years ago, and we finally bumped into each other at a couple conferences. And since that time, we've had a couple of conversations about shame. And he's taken the time to watch a couple episodes of Erasing Shame, and it's provoked an interesting conversation. So we're going to share that with our audience here today. So thanks for watching and listening. Fred, thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be here. I think we actually met, I want to say 2003, maybe, yeah, it was a while ago, because it was the Asian American Leadership Conference, I think, down in Los Angeles. I think the first year was 2003. So it's been more than a couple of years, DJ.
Well, that's 15, 16 years. So
yeah.
That's over a decade.
Yeah. Cause you've been blogging for how long? How long have you been blogging?
I've been blogging since 1999.
Okay. Yeah. So I think I found you maybe a couple of years after that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's been some time. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, before we get into our topic today, what would you like our audience to know about you?
Yeah, so I'm actually in San Jose, which I think if you're from no, it's okay. If you're from Northern California, there is a pretty significant difference between San Francisco and San Jose. And then I grew up here. I'm the associate pastor at Garden City Church, and I've been there for 2.5 years. Before that, I was a pastor in a Chinese immigrant church. I was an English pastor for 9 years, and then before that, it was in tech. I worked for IBM and Hitachi. And yeah, so that's part of my story. I've been in the Chinese church for a long time. So I became a believer in the Chinese church, spent 24 years there, and then just recently moved to the multi-ethnic / white church. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of story there.
Yes.
Behind that as well, I'm sure. So I hope to learn more about that. But for our Erasing Shame podcast, we have a very wide audience, both Asian and non-Asian, Christian and non-Christian. But because you work with people in a very intensive way as a pastor, I think you can bring a unique perspective about shame because it's such a personal as well as a communal kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And we don't hear much about it. And so, I mean, that's why we started this podcast last year to talk about shame, because shame festers in silence, according to Brené Brown. And I thought it's kind of funny that you recently wrote a blog post at Rant of the Exiles, and the URL is bread before rice?
Yeah.
Rice before bread?
Bread before rice.blogspot.com.
Okay. And we'll add that in the show notes. And you're going toe-to-toe with Brené Brown, who has popularized shame in the American consciousness.
Yeah.
So that's going to be our topic today. What is the relationship between shame and the Asian American identity?
Yeah. So I think, first off, I owe a great debt to Brené Brown. And I did watch her TED Talk, and I did read her book, Daring Greatly. I think that's her first book, or one of her first books, that kind of put her on the map. And I appreciate how she's contributed to really just exposing this idea of shame to popular culture and helping to draw attention to something that I think in a lot of Asian American circles, we just don't know how to talk about, like you said. So I think I'm very much indebted to that. However, I think there are some aspects of shame that she has overlooked, primarily because she's not Asian. She doesn't have Asian heritage or perhaps understand Asian culture. And so she's coming at it from a Western lens, which is perfectly understandable. And she's tapping into some emotions that I think we're, as Asian Americans, generally ill-equipped to talk about. And so I really appreciate that contribution. However, I think there's just more work to be done to help contextualize it for us as Asian Americans who are communal. And the Bible is written in the culture of the ancient Near East. So it has a lot to say about shame, but it's not going to do so from Brené Brown's perspective.
Okay, so we're going to unpack a bit of that for our audience, and then certainly point them to the articles, because you were so articulate in expressing some of the key points that distinguish a different perspective on shame from a collectivistic culture or group and oriented culture. That is the mindset of the Asia and Chinese and
Right.
the ancient Near Eastern of the Bible as well. So let's review those 3 points for our audience, and let's have a conversation about each one. So the first thing, well, let's just start where you started. So the first thing is an Eastern perspective on shame is different than the Western perspective.
Right.
So and what's different about it?
Right. So I think Brené is kind of working backwards, right?
Mm-hmm.
She's working back from the emotion and the end outcome. So when you feel uncomfortable and it leads to some kind of, and you have this associated sense of worthlessness, then you're experiencing, then just kind of like whatever, she's reverse engineering this idea of shame and saying, hey, if you feel worthless, then you are experiencing shame. Whereas I think in Asian culture, it's the opposite, where when you have deviated, okay, from, because you're part of a group, right? In the collectivist culture, you're part of a group. When you stepped outside the culture's norms or values and you're exposed, you know what I mean? You're exposed in some way. There's a relational rift. That is shame, right? So in the same way, you can bring honor to a group by performing well according to the values. The opposite of that is disgrace, is shame, right? But that's an objective experience, right? The subjective part is the emotional state, right? And so Brené is talking about the emotional state. And I'm not as concerned, or I shouldn't say I'm not as concerned. I'm concerned about the whole pipeline, right?
Yeah.
The things that led up to that emotional experience, but I'm not letting shame be defined by the emotional experience. It's the objective part of the relational rift caused by exposure from being misaligned with the group's values. That would be my working definition. Yeah.
But even in a collective culture, like, and both of us are Chinese, so we'll just speak for Chinese and not for all of Asian America. Even shame in a collective culture is experienced individually. And that's why we do have problems, even in Asia, for those who don't measure up to social standards of earning or of having straight A's. And we have a terrible problem of suicide and mental illness. How do you speak to that?
Yeah, I think you're seeing that negative mental health outcomes, right? Because I'm reading iGen by Jean Twenge, right? That's the book about the emerging generation, you know, those born between 1995 to 2012, something like that. And you got skyrocketing rates of anxiety, depression, teen suicide, those kind of aspects. And that's a Western, this is an American phenomenon, right? And I think you're also seeing that kind of across the board all over the world that's associated with technology, right? Social media usage. So there's something with that that's just unprecedented and very different in terms of fragmentation of community, right? So I'm not sure I would necessarily pinpoint, Chinese culture, you know what I mean? Chinese culture, a shame-based culture for that, right? Because I don't know that.
I'm not sure that's fair, because before the internet, Asia still had the problem of suicide and people feeling
Okay.
So
yeah. So for sure, there's a suppressive, repressive aspect to Chinese culture, and probably most Asian and Eastern cultures, where it's not acceptable to talk about emotion. And one thing for sure we owe Brené Brown a debt is being able to address these kind of issues. So absolutely. And yet at the same time, there is something about being connected to a larger group that provides a sense of security, right? So yes, you're right. There is an increased, you could say, shame load within Eastern culture, right? Within Chinese culture. And yet it's dispersed across, you know what I mean? The whole point is that it's not born by an individual, it's born by the family or the hometown or the entire nation, right? And when that happens, the focus isn't just about yourself. Like by nature, the focus is not just about you. Whereas here, everything's kind of privatized, going back to the individual. So if you bear it yourself, it has to mean something inherently, wrong or worthless about you as an individual. But that's not the way, Chinese society works. If something's wrong with you, it's something wrong with your family. It's shared, right? And I'm not saying that's any less toxic, but it's a different frame. It's a different perspective.
Yes. And given that, so I think the particular point that you make really well is that because we experience shame differently as Asians and Asian Americans, it affects our identity.
Right.
And so say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, part of the aspect is we don't see in Chinese culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not just an individual. You're primarily a family member, right? And so what I do as a son reflects on my parents, right? And that never changes. So I can bring honor to my parents or my family, or I can bring dishonor. I can bring shame, right? And so that affects, so it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Which comes first, the shame or the identity? Probably the identity first, right? If you identify, as part of a family unit, then the shame component is going to come from that, right? But it's all about how you identify first, and then the rest of it. But it's all a package, right? I don't know that it's that easy to parse out, but you experience shame over the group that you identify with. That's how I would talk about it.
And actually, if you look at the nomenclature of how at least Chinese names are made, it's the family name first.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so just in the naming, family name first, because you're part of the family and your identity comes from the group, not your individual accomplishments or your individual expression or whatever that is. So another part of that then would be for someone who's Asian Americans, and I'm not sure what generation you are. I came to the US when I was 8. So you come from a collective mindset family, but you live in an individualistic society. So what does that do to a person?
Well, I think it's just kind of a strange experience where I think as Asian Americans, you just learn to navigate, right? And kind of go between these two worlds. And I think it's definitely easier when you're in a major metro area with lots of other Asian Americans, because you're kind of experiencing this cognitive dissonance together, right? And there's less of a disconnect between your private family life and your public life at school or work, whatever, right? And so I think I'm doing a book club with this, I think this book was written 20 years ago, The Following Jesus Without Dishonoring Your Parents, with Paul Tokunaga, Greg Cha, I think it is. And so it's been interesting because one of the guys who's Korean grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, and he resented his ethnic identity. And he didn't realize that a lot of his learned behaviors in terms of communication and conflict avoidance were from his family of origin, but it was all part of, this cognitive dissonance was so intense that he just didn't even realize he had an ethnic identity until much later on in life. And he didn't appreciate it. So there was this tremendous self-hatred that he only has, in the last, I don't know how many years, let's say 5 years, began to grapple with and wrestle with, which he didn't realize, right? And I think the problem is when you're an Asian American that grows up in, like, let's say San Jose, it's a lot easier to be ignorant of the cognitive dissonance because you don't have to deal with it as much, and you can kind of be unaware of it. You don't have to worry about navigating. The discrepancy is not as great, right? But then you don't have to really think about the difference between your home life and your public life because the gap isn't as great. And that's too bad too, because I think there are a lot of Asian Americans or Chinese Americans in particular who don't really think about culture or their ethnic identity because they haven't had to. Absolutely. They don't have to deal with it.
Well, even if they do, they don't.
Right. That's right.
Because we don't know how to talk about it.
That's right.
And I think in our last conversation, you did mention that we don't talk about it because we don't want to dishonor our tribe.
There's something about that, and I think honestly too, there's just kind of these layers of self-hatred that are not easy to express, right? And no one enjoys being able to say, "Hey, I want to be white," and right, because there is something shameful about self-hatred, right? But that's implicitly by people's actions what they're doing, right? When we go more towards these other Western kind of modes of expression and communication.
Okay, good point. Now, so we've looked at a bit of the collective aspect of shame. You've also considered some positive aspects of shame in that Asian culture that is worth bringing out and highlighting. So share a bit more about I think you call it the 5 values.
Yeah. Oh, so Jonathan Haidt, I'm kind of a fan of his. I know he's vilified in certain circles, but like one of his most recent books is about the coddling of the American mind, right?
Mm.
And and behind it is the prioritization of emotions, right? Emotions dictate reality. And so, and I think that's a tough thing within, if you evaluate Chinese culture from the standpoint of emotions, we're always going to be deficient relative to Western culture, right? Because that's just not the highest value.
Now, when Jonathan says that, he's not a proponent of that. He's making an observation that in our culture, feelings tend to dominate, right?
Exactly. He's rebuking that. He's saying that's one of the, he doesn't use the word idolatry, but that's what I would call it as a Christian, that there's an idolatry of the private emotional life. And the gift of shame is that, not that it's because that disgrace is real, and there are times when disgrace is important in order to move social change, in order to experience communal change. So like one example I would use is Jesus. He was absolutely not afraid to buck social convention, to rebuke the Pharisees, who were the Jewish ruling authority, and to experience disgrace as a result, right? And because he was explicitly not aligned with their religious values. So I think there's always a role as a believer of embracing shame, because we don't always want to live in alignment with popular culture. We definitely don't want to live in alignment with popular culture's values. And with, honestly, any human culture, we want to have some distance from, right? We want to be careful that we're completely aligned with. So there's an important role in disgrace. There's an important role in the life of a Christian in experiencing disgrace or some level of shame, because there's something better, right? We recognize there's something cursed about every human culture. We want to rebuke it. So that's what I would say is the positive aspect. And by the way, I did listen to your podcast, right, about positive aspects of shame, and I agree with all those things. I think it definitely can be a moral gauge, but we have to be discerning and say, hey, and I think you definitely highlight that too in the podcast, where we need to be discerning about, are we experiencing shame legitimately, right? If let's say we choose not to be a doctor but go into ministry, right, we face a lot of cultural pressures, family pressure to become a doctor, and then experience disgrace because we didn't. We have to recognize, okay, we're outside the family's values, but that's maybe not necessarily a value we're aligned with and don't want to be aligned with, right? Now, it doesn't mean we dishonor our parents in that, but we want to be respectful and honoring to them, and yet we also recognize we're not going to share that same value.
Wow, you've just begun to unpack a huge aspects of shame. So thank you for stepping into this with us. And I'm sure that a lot more work needs to be done to really articulate this and unpack this, because it seems to me be pretty new territory, even though we have had hundreds of generations of Asian culture.
Right.
And so thank you for doing that. And what one last thought. So as you work with people as a spiritual community leader, how do you help people that are struggling with shame in a collective culture?
Or individualistic culture? What do you mean? Sorry.
Collective culture, the Asian Americans that are experiencing shame collectively. Yeah.
Got it.
How do you help them?
Right. Well, I think the ultimate resolution for shame is finding our worth and really our honor in the eyes of someone else, externally, right? It cannot come from ourselves. It has to come externally. And as a believer, I see that as Jesus, that worth and value, that shame is covered by Jesus. So he gives the honor that I do not deserve, because we in our state naturally deserve disgrace. Okay. Right. And so when we come from that standpoint, there's a certain freedom from the debilitating, toxic aspects of shame, which we're always going to be tempted towards. And so I think it's important. The way I counsel or disciple people is always to be pointing back to that, and to recognize that those subconscious attitudes of worthlessness are part of our flesh, and we don't have to be chained to them. But they're not going to go away easily, right? It's not just a matter of repeating to yourself, Jesus loves you. It's a matter of allowing the Spirit of God to kind of like replace certain haunting images that probably came from childhood, replacing them with healthy, positive images of what God's love is like, and to be reparented by our ultimate intended Father, who is God.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, shame has affected those of us who are young adults a majority of our audience in their 20s and 30s. So having lived and experienced so much of that, perhaps in their family context or in their Asian social context, 20 plus years of influence isn't going to go away in a snap.
Absolutely.
So it's going to take some time.
Right.
And do you have a word of hope for those who are not Christians?
Yeah, I think what it is to recognize some of our culture's excesses, right? Like, I think Brené Brown has given a great contribution, but we don't have to buy everything. We don't have to agree with everything that our culture says. I think it's important to be able to filter that through a certain lens, so we can appreciate certain things about Western culture, but also appreciate some certain things about for me, my Chinese heritage and the Chinese cultural value system. So I guess it would always be to filter through the beliefs about shame that we hear, to filter it through a certain lens, to discern what is best and most helpful. And if it leads to self-hatred, right? If it leads to some resentment, maybe be a little more inquisitive about it, and not be so quick to judge, Chinese culture or Asian culture as being inherently negative or inherently evil, something like that.
Okay. Well, very good. Very good. Thank you so much, Fred, for helping us to see the positive aspects of not just shame, but also of our Asian cultures, which are sometimes difficult to see because we're soaked in such a Western individualistic society, and we don't have many occasions to hear people explain how our culture works and how it positively influences us. So, yeah. Fred,
can I say one more thing? I think, yeah, you mentioned something about how can we experience shame more collectively, and I was thinking about one way to answer that. I think, especially for men, the sports is a huge way. Like the Warriors, the Golden State Warriors won last night, and we experience shame and dishonor collectively when we talk about we as a basketball team. Like people say we won or we lost, right? We experience shame and honor collectively when we talk about when we're huge fans of a sports team because we identify with them.
Yes.
Does that make sense? And so I think that's in some ways like a metaphor, maybe more than a metaphor, of how to experience shame collectively. That's the closest, proximate. And so there are some positive aspects to going with the team, right? But obviously if your team is good, it's great. But if your team is bad, then you experience, but the great thing is when you experience shame about your team losing, that's shared. There's a commonality and a connectedness that you are not alone in experiencing shame, the disgrace of your losing team.
There you go. Misery loves company.
That's right. Exactly.
Well, this is great.
Exactly.
This is great. So shame, there's two, let me have a couple takeaways, so see which one resonates for you. So
sure.
Shame has an individualistic as well as a collective aspect, two sides of the same coin.
Yes.
So we need to look at it holistically.
Amen.
And guilt is very individualistic and transactional. I don't know if that's the right word. And then shame is relational and communal.
Right.
Something like that.
Right.
Okay.
Inherently so, yes.
Okay, Fred. Well, thanks for thinking out loud for us as our community, because it's very hard to find voices that are interested in this. So you're a unique individual to be blogging about this and now coming on and talking about this. Thank you for doing that. And we'll add a link to your blog post in the show notes and encourage our viewers and listeners to read more about Fred's thoughts, because he has given us very good thoughts. So thank you for being with us. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for being a part of Erasing Shame. Please rate and review on iTunes, subscribe on YouTube, and like on Facebook. Share with your friends and followers. Together, we are erasing shame one story at a time. Get all the details at erasingshame.com.